The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the webinar. Today's webinar is by Rob Lambert of New Voice Media, and he will be presenting Moving to Weekly Releases, A Journey, which is one of the more popular presentations at the EuroSTAR Conference 2013. If you have any questions for Rob, you can type them into the discussion forum on testhuddle.com. And Test Huddle is a new online community for software testing professionals, and it has a whole host of testing resources such as ebooks and webinars, as well as other discussion forum topics. And I'm just going to send you all a link now so you can see exactly where you have to go. So there's the link, and I will now hand you over to Rob, and he will take you through his presentation. Hello, Rob.
Hi. So hi everyone, thank you for joining me on this webinar. So you have to bear with me, I've got a man flu, but that's fine. I'm sure we'll rustle on through this and it'll all be good. So my name is Rob Lambert. I'm an engineering manager at New Voice Media. So New Voice Media are building pretty awesome cloud-based contact center service. We can see on the screen, you might see a few of the testers there. You might recognize a few faces. You might recognize some of those people from Twitter as well. So last year at EuroSTAR, I presented about our journey from yearly releases to weekly releases. This webinar is basically a similar sort of talk, but I've expanded a few sections based on some of the feedback that I got after the presentation. So I'll be digging a little deeper into some of the more technical aspects about how we flow work through our system and what this means for our testers. The important point to make, though, is that the process is always changing, and it's actually this continuous improvement and this continuous change that enabled us really to move from those yearly releases to the weekly releases. So one of the big questions I always get asked is why am I not a big fan of these major releases? So really there's three reasons. The first one is that major releases are typically quite slow. They're typically quite painful. There's a lot of process involved. There's a lot of people involved with doing, for example, a yearly release. And they often start off on the wrong foot, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. Secondly, the markets shift and change. So when your customers' markets are moving quicker than your release cycle, you're in a bit of trouble because the market's going to shift underneath you. You can't deliver in time to keep up with the market. And thirdly, the only feedback that really ever matters in software development is really the feedback from your customers. So the people using the product, people who are buying your product. So the shorter you can make that feedback loop, the better it really is for all involved. So I'm going to quickly walk through some of the problems that I've experienced with working in some of these major release environments. But I want to make it clear that what follows is not really me saying that things like waterfall and V-model don't work, because I'm sure they do work for some people. What I'm highlighting is some of the waste that's in these processes, and it's waste that really we didn't want to continue dealing with. We wanted to try and get rid of some of that waste. So the major problem really is that most companies start off with a spec. The problem is that this spec becomes a single source of truth. We spend a huge amount of time reviewing it, signing it off. We put it through change controls. We build test plans around it. We build development plans around it. And the crucial thing is that nothing has actually yet been built. So for some people, I mean, in some examples, I've maybe spent 2 or 3 months defining the spec, defining all of the stuff that comes with it, and we still haven't yet actually built anything. So I mean, what would happen if that spec was actually wrong? So when would we actually work out that what we were building was not right? So another example, a true story, is I worked on a project for about 12 months, and at the end of that 12 months when we delivered it to a customer, the customer didn't want it. They didn't ask for any of the stuff that's in there. We'd made a mistake during the requirements analysis, through the specification and all the other things that come with it. Mostly that was based on the fact that there's two problems here. One is that the person that we often speak to gather the requirements often isn't the person who ends up using the product. They're often a project manager, they might be a business analyst within the business, but fundamentally they're often not the person who's there on the ground floor with the problem that the software is aiming to solve. There's also another problem, is that the person who's gathering those requirements might not understand them. So they may add their own flavor to it, they may add their own features into that and pass them off as the customers. And basically they may even just get them wrong. They may just totally misinterpret what's actually being asked for. So Henry Ford made a good statement once when he said that if he'd have asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And in the end, he ended up building the motor car and kickstarting an entire industry. And this is the same thing that we have with the spec. We trust that the spec is accurate. We've asked our customers what they want, and the specification is the final thing, is the source of truth that we end up starting on a very long journey from. And like I say, nothing's actually been built by this point. So long release cycles are often live in these methodologies that we've become so familiar with, things like the V model and the waterfall. The models are there really to kind of articulate really what the people's roles and responsibilities are, to articulate some of the stages that we go through, some of the things and the artifacts that people need to kind of produce as we go through. The problem with this kind of approach, though, is that most of these models suggest that testing happens after the code has been written, and by some considerable margin. But by doing this, we're actually artificially adding in a very slow release cycle. The time difference sometimes between writing a piece of code and getting it tested can be weeks or months. But even worse, between writing the code and it being deployed can often be a very epic proportion of time. You could be looking at somewhere like 6 to 9 months between writing a feature and that feature actually being used in production. And like we talked about, what happens if that feature is actually wrong? So when you come to release it, you're months away from getting that feedback. So in almost all development environments, somebody somewhere wants to know when we're going to be done. In my experience, it's usually just a simple case of pulling a figure out of the air. Historically, I've always, in past when I've worked in these release cycles, literally taken the development estimate and said that's exactly the same as the test estimate. So for example, if the developer said, well, it's going to take 3 months to build this, then I'd say, well, it's going to take 3 months to test this. If they said 6 months, then I'd say 6 months. I was surprisingly accurate with that approach, but I also know someone else who doubles the dev figure, and so if they say 3 months, she'll say 6 months for the testing, and she's incredibly accurate with that figure as well. But I also know someone else who halves the dev value and then adds back on a quarter, and they're mostly accurate with theirs. It's that kind of phenomenon where the work fills the time available. But fundamentally, no matter what calculation we're using in these long feedback loops, we're adding in some sort of delay between building something and getting that out to our customers. The problem is, though, even though we do that estimation process, what typically happens is we've already got a deadline. So there's a commercial deadline probably being set by somebody. And because we've got this big release that we're heading towards, we are fundamentally tied into a date. We have to plan around a release that's going live. So the challenge comes in, obviously, if we're going to estimate, we need to know when we're going to be done testing. A common question I get asked about moving to shorter release cycles is, when do you know you're going to be done testing? And the question is, well, how do we know we're going to be done testing in these big major release cycles? So we tend to fall back on metrics that are quite common in the industry, things like test case completion. And this is basically saying that if you know how many test cases you've got, and you know how many people you've got, and you know roughly how long it takes a person to complete a test case, you can basically work out the elapsed time it's going to take to complete all the test cases you've identified. You can then start tweaking it, so you can then say, oh, well, what if we made our testers work longer hours and they completed an extra 50% test cases? Then we could be finished earlier. Or what if we threw more testers into the pool? Again, we could be finished earlier. Maybe we want to delete some tests, in which case we can hit this deadline. The reality is that all the way through the testing phase, in my experience, the test case completion metric really is the one that everybody looks at. How close are we to being finished testing? I mean, obviously, we're heading towards that magic 100%. The problem with this, though, is that not all test cases are created equal. So some may take a few minutes to run, some may take a few hours to run, some might even take days to set up. So when I joined New Voice Media about 4 years ago, we were doing the very last Big Bang release that we ever did, really. And we were stuck at about 87% complete for around about 3 or 4 weeks. So what was happening? Were we actually executing test cases? Were we adding more test cases back in at the rate at which we were completing them. Why did we stay sort of complete at 87% for such a long time? So it's because test cases aren't created equal. And also in my experience, towards the end of any sort of major release cycle, and this is something that quite a few people at EuroSTAR last year confirmed, was you start to realize that using test case completion metrics, you're not going to hit that deadline. You're not going to get to that magical 100% by the time the deadline comes around. So obviously we have testers working evenings and working weekends, and we buy them pizza to say thank you and all that sort of stuff. But towards the end of it, in the final few weeks, we end up having to put a call out to the rest of the business. And it goes something like, who knows how to operate keyboard and mouse? Please come and see us tomorrow and grab some test cases. And this happens in every business that I've worked in where we've done this. Fundamentally, everybody from across the business starts running test cases. So you'll end up with people from HR, marketing, sales, support, anybody who can run a test case runs a test case. The big thing for me and the most upsetting part about that whenever I've worked in these environments is I often wonder what that says about the role of a tester if anybody can do that. But it's reality. We're aiming towards that 100% completion. We're not going to do it with the testers we've got, so we draft in people from across the business. Eventually, though, we probably never get to that magical 100%, but what we do happen to get to is a number that somebody somewhere feels comfortable with. It could be 87% complete, it could be 94, it could be 95, whatever it is, somebody somewhere has deemed that the number of tests that we have completed is good enough to ship the software. So we ship it. And in my experience, it usually always comes back to bite you at some point. So I've never actually ever worked on a major release in all 11, 12 years of working in those environments. I don't think I ever saw a release go out that didn't come back with something that wasn't quite right. Now that's inevitable. Developing software is a very messy business. It's a very difficult business to get right. There'll always be bugs. The problem is in these major release environments, though, is you could be 10 months ago that the code that was wrong was written. So the developer who wrote it might not even be here any longer. If they are, it's probably going to take them quite a few hours, maybe even a day or so, to get their head back into what it was they were building. But the biggest problem with these kind of major release cycles is that you've now got months and months worth of other code and other work stacked on or around the problem area. And if the foundations are wrong because the spec was wrong, because the requirements were wrong, you've got a huge amount of code to unpick. I know I was speaking to someone after the conference last year who gave me an example of where the business was deciding to lose customers because the features weren't to their satisfaction over trying to fix the features purely because the cost of fixing the features was just so high. They just totally got this part of the product wrong. And it's a sad state of affairs where people are willing to lose customers over the fact of not building anything to correct that. Secondly, the second reason we needed to move to more frequent releases was because our markets were moving very, very fast. So our customers' needs were shifting faster than our release cycle. So when this happens, it's really only a matter of time before a competitor with a shorter release cycle and a compelling set of features swoops in and offers them the service that you can't. The reality is there's some very major companies now falling to the wayside because they simply can't move fast enough for the current needs of the market. Also, the cost of switching now and changing to different suppliers is becoming a lot cheaper. So people are looking for alternative ways to improve and maintain their service. One thing we wanted to be sure of was that we were the ones doing the disruption around this and not one of those big players that just couldn't keep up with the market. And obviously that third reason that we talked about was about reducing the feedback loops. So the only feedback that really matters in software development is the feedback from people buying and using the product or service. So the faster that we can get that software out to our customers, the faster we can get that feedback on whether or not it's right. That fundamentally makes it better for everyone involved. The customers end up with the product that they actually want and can use, and you end up developing that product with the least amount of cost, hopefully, in delivering that. So it's pretty clear that I have a slight downer towards long release cycles. Thankfully, quite a few people in the business shared the same opinion. So we made a decision. We made a decision to move to more frequent releases. So a question I always get asked about this is, how did we actually go about making that change? And was the change easy? So I'll answer part of that first. No, it wasn't easy. It was far from easy. It was actually very, very painful at times. We put out quite a lot of fires. We had lots and lots of discussions, and it was a very, very, very difficult time. There were many a time where we'd go home and probably think, are we making the right decision here? But fundamentally, we did make the best decision, and what we think we did, and we're now moving with weekly releases. So there's lots of different aspects involved with what we did. There's all sorts of stuff that I'm probably not going to talk about today at all, but I'm happy to maybe talk about later. There's other stuff, the commercial reasons about how and why we managed to do it. But really there's the three main things which I encourage other people who want to go on a similar journey to do. Firstly is to create a simple single vision. So we created a vision of weekly releases. It was a very, very simple vision. There's not a lot of complexity around the actual vision statement, and it's very, very easily quantified. We're either doing weekly releases or we're not. The second thing that we did was we adopted Agile as a way of working. Truth be told, we never really went in straight for the Scrum commitment-based sprints. We went straight into a sort of lean Kanban approach to software development. I think the industry is starting to call it Scrumban. Whatever it is, it's the way that we work, and it's probably unique to what we do, like all Agile methodologies are to each company. And the third thing, a very, very important aspect of this was to start breaking down barriers between teams to create cross-functional work. So it's no good being able to build software if we can't actually ship it, support it, or sell it. So true quality for our customers, and this is the customer service, true quality really only comes across departments. So to make the changes, we needed to have the buy-in from all the other people in the business. So we started socializing the idea, we discussed it with other departments, we found people within the business who were engaged in it, who could sort of promote it within their own departments, and we created a sort of snowball effect of people really pushing towards this vision. Another common question that I get asked is whether or not this happened overnight. It didn't, no. It's, unless you've got lots and lots of money and you've got lots and lots of people at your disposal, so to speak, it's incredibly difficult to move from a yearly release to a more frequent release. As you can see here on the slide, we started off with yearly, and then I think the next release was 6 months after that yearly release. We did a few interim patches and a few interim builds between there, but really the next major release was kind of 6 months, and it wasn't really a major release, it was more just an enhancement. 3 months after that we did another release, and then about a few weeks and a few months after that we moved into this fortnightly release cycle, which was really as fast as we could actually get it to go at the time. Then from fortnightly to weekly took probably about 6 months. There was lots of process to iron out. There was a huge amount of things for us to overcome and get into that weekly thing. All told, probably about 1.5 years between moving from yearly releases to weekly releases. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the kind of flow. So this is the feedback from last year's EuroSTAR, was people were very interested in the actual technical aspects of what it's like to do testing within such a short frame of work. So I'm going to talk you through some of the processes that we've got in place. Now, if you have any questions about this, obviously log on to the test huddle and fire them there. I am on Twitter at Rob_Lambert, so you can fire questions there. I've got Twitter open here, so I will see some of those questions come through if you're interested, and I'll try and answer them in the rest of the webinar. So we're going to talk through the life of a story as we do it. So I talked about the big specs. I talked about the fact that you might get that wrong. We tend to work in what's called user stories. These are very small pieces of work. They are, in a sense, smaller versions of specs. So we still could have the same problem with a spec in that we spoke to the wrong people, we didn't do the right analysis, we could be bringing stuff in that isn't quite right. But we've appreciated that that is potentially going to happen, and that's why we work on very small pieces of work that we can get in front of our customers, get that feedback, and then work out whether or not we've got the right thing. So, as talked about, we run a very lean variant of Agile, so we pull stories from left to right. We have limited work in progress for most of the teams. They're not going to pull in lots of stories that they can't do, so we try to get one thing done and off the board and into production, and then we work on the next thing. We don't always know for sure whether we're done, and it's very, very difficult for anybody in software development to know whether or not you've done enough testing. That's why in the Agile world we have something called the definition of done. We have one. It's in a nutshell. At the bottom right-hand side of the slide, you can see that most of the checking is automated. That would be a definition of done. We have a UI test if we need one. We have done our exploratory testing. We've produced documentation, and we've discussed with the performance and the security teams as to whether or not we need to do any further performance or security testing around the feature that we're building. There's a huge lot more beside that, but in a nutshell, that's what it means to us to be done. So when a story goes into a team, it isn't done, it doesn't move into that done column and then therefore into production until we have at least those things checked, plus a few others. So here's a more detailed look. So this is something that's going to be going up on my blog in the next sort of few weeks or so. But this is a kind of work in progress process that we have in place. So as you can see, we have some things that come into the sprint or into the team, and then we have some things that go out. Now this is the detail of what happens. This is really how our process has ended up from the big spec with the development and the testing phases into a life cycle of a story where testing is kind of, it's not a phase anymore, it's just an activity that happens. Ironically, moving from big release to short release, we do way more testing than we ever did. The thing is, the testing is now done by everyone in the team, and the testing is no longer, like I say, a phase, it's an activity, it's something that just happens. So for each of the stories, we make sure that we break down the acceptance criteria in a behavior-driven development style. BDD, behavior-driven development, is a way of aligning expectations about a story, discussing it in a language that's accessible by all the team, and ultimately ending up with a set of automated tests at the end of that. I'd encourage you to read more about BDD on the web. A quick search will give you loads of cool resources. Even if you don't use it day to day in your development of user stories and features, it's still a really good way of getting people to talk about features and driving out the design of it. Our programmers do loads of really good unit testing, and it's done in a test-driven development way typically, so we end up with a very high level of unit tests for our stories. But ultimately the goal at the end of it is to have that story with a Selenium user journey, a BDD, and we use a tool called SpecFlow, and we have unit tests as well. This basically means that all of the checking is done by a computer. So we try to discourage the fact of a tester having to check stuff against the story. Does the story do what it says it should do? We really should have got that automated by this point. So this really frees up the tester to explore the product. Occasionally we will end up with some test cases. So down here on the bottom left you'll see that we have some test cases. These are basically checks that cannot or will not be automated but may need to be run again sometime. So the team will have made a decision that they're not going to automate those tests. We may want to run them again, hence we're going to create some test cases. We have very, very few of these because really if we're going to run these things again, we want to get them automated. We will add these to our test case management tool and they'll become part of a regression suite. So I'll explain a little bit more later about exploratory testing process, but suffice to say the outcome for the testing from the exploratory testing will be fed back into the cycle. So for example, while we're doing exploratory testing, we may discover further acceptance criteria that we may not have discussed before. So we'll put that back onto the story and create some BDD SpecFlow tests for that. We may just have observations and questions and we'll just flow those back into the team to discuss those. Of course, we may have bugs that need fixing as well, and we may discover further things that we want to run as an exploratory test. So we'll just put those in there as more tests to run against that story. On the right-hand side, you'll see the outcomes from the process. It's kind of quite straightforward. We want to get a completed story, and that means all the automated tests. We want to get exploratory testing notes, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, but these are the notes that the testers make as they do their testing. We'll also ideally have some product documentation that we can provide to our technical author for publishing out to our customers, and we'll also maybe, but hopefully not, have some of those static checks, these test cases that we'll put into a regression pack and probably run again based on risk-based analysis. As you see at the bottom, there's two sections. Each of the teams really has two goals, and this has really been the goals that have driven us from those yearly releases to where we are now with the weekly releases. And this is a kind of ethos that we try to recruit against, and this is an ethos that we really try to kind of instill in the team. Number one is improve the process. and number 2 is reduce the cycle time. So all processes can be improved, so it's important that each of the teams are looking for ways to improve the process. I think if anyone sits and looks at a process and says there's nothing to improve, I think we're not really looking hard enough. There's always something to be improved about a testing process, a build process, a deployment process. There's always room for improvement. So it's really about identifying waste and getting rid of it, but only if reducing that waste makes it better for our customers. I've seen it too many times in other companies where we've improved part of the testing process, but it's fundamentally affected the overall system. So it's entirely possible to reduce waste in a process and make the whole of the ecosystem that you're working in more unstable. So cycle time refers to how long work lives within our development system. So it's from the time when a story is brought into the team and said we're going to start working on this, to the time that the product owner signs it off. That is the cycle time, and we measure it in days. Although we do sometimes set a target to say maybe let's try and get that cycle time under 5 days, the reality is that we're always trying to improve the cycle time. So if it's 10 days, we're trying to improve it. If it's 5 days, we're trying to improve it. We're always trying to get that cycle time down, because the cycle time is really how quick things can flow through our system. So we also have Kaizen. Kaizen is a kind of process improvement technique that comes from sort of Toyota and the whole Japanese process improvement movement. A lot of the teams have a Kaizen board, and a Kaizen board is really where people just put ideas up there of things that they can improve, things that the teams can fix. So it might be that it takes you, an hour or so to log onto a machine to do something. We can improve that. Let's try and get that time down to 10 minutes, etc. So that's the Kaizen process improvement that each of the teams works within. So one thing that surprised me last year was how many people I spoke to after my presentation that they themselves were quite surprised that we relied pretty much on exploratory testing. Our testers do very little checking apart from some of the regression testing towards the release. And instead we focus very heavily on exploratory testing. So the thing is, if we've got the process right, if we've automated the story and we've automated the acceptance criteria and all of the checks have been automated, then realistically we've freed up our testers to do exploratory testing. So our exploratory testing tends to be very data informed, which I'll talk about in a minute, meaning that we rely very heavily on the system under test to provide us with some feedback. So we do this through the heavy use of tools. We gather logs, reports, metrics, all sorts of stuff coming back from the product itself. We sometimes do pair testing, and we're always doing risk-based testing. So we'll always, with our exploratory testing, be focusing on the high impact areas, the bits that are changing, maybe some problematic areas or some bits that we don't really understand some of the nuances of bringing all of this software together. So the combination of automation and exploratory testing really has been a key to us reducing the release cycle times. It's pretty much impossible to release often unless you automate your feature work. There are other alternatives. You could take the risk of not testing stuff and just ship it, or you could hire thousands of people to check the product every week to make sure it's still conforming and still doing what it should do. We've chosen the automation route because it's the one that seems to make the most sense. So here is a kind of description about how we manage our exploratory testing. So there's a very common misconception about exploratory testing in that it's ad hoc and it's random and therefore there's no auditability, there's no accountability attached to it. I actually believe that that's not true. I think it can be like that, but it can also be very different. So I believe that all of exploratory testing, if done within a sort of defined process, can very much be audited and can be used to trace what has or has not been tested. So here's our current process for reporting on exploratory testing. I actually posted this to my blog probably a couple of months back now. But basically, we create charters. We use Elizabeth Hendrickson's description of a charter from her book Explorer. It's a very good book. I definitely recommend you read it. It basically starts with saying we want to explore something with something to discover something. So for example, we want to explore audio upload files with huge file sizes to discover what the limitations are around bandwidth. That's an example of an exploratory charter. So we'd have a story, we'll have lots of these charters that the testers have identified they want to run. There'll be new ones that emerge as we do more testing. We then run the session. The testers are given a kind of free rein to use whatever tool they want to record their session notes. We've got some people in the team using the very, very good Rapid Reporter. We've got people using notebooks, scribbling down by pen. We've got some people using Evernote. We've got other people using Notepad++, Byword. We've got people using Screener and screen grabbing tools, etc. No matter what tool they use, ultimately all of those session notes end up in Confluence, which is our wiki system for basically storing everything that we do. We then log those results in a Google form. So it's a very, very simple form that basically the results go into a spreadsheet. We log things such as the date, the area that we've done the testing, the Confluence link back to the actual session notes, the browsers that we tested in, the actual charter titles, etc., etc. These results can then be pulled by the management team, so we can look at what areas we're covering, what browsers we're looking at, what kind of coverage we're getting. Are we seeing an increase in exploratory testing? Are we seeing some teams that aren't doing enough exploratory testing? All these kind of cool things can be brought out from this data. It's all auditable, it's all manageable, we can report this to the auditors, it's not a problem at all to get exploratory testing under some sort of framework. So talk a little bit about data informed. A lot of the modern tools and a lot of the modern websites and a lot of the tools available to testers actually give you a really good amount of power to try and guide your testing and see what kind of impact your testing is actually having. So, for example, we can use data that the product and the supporting tools are telling us to guide our testing, or we can actually just use those tools to be in real time seeing what is happening when we're hitting keys, logging things, sending requests, etc. A good example is a tool called New Relic. It's a very, very cool tool that's running on our web servers, and it's basically telling you what your product's doing. So, for example, we can look into New Relic and we can see what pages our customers on our production environment are finding slow, which ones are taking the longest to load. We can find out which pages are the most heavily visited, and even things like we can find out which browsers are the most commonly used browsers. So, for example, if we find that Internet Explorer 8 is our most common browser used by our customers, then that's really where the bulk of our testing should probably be focused. So it gives us vital clues. It gives the testers a real good sense of focus for their exploratory testing. We can also use tools, for example, like Firebug and Fiddler to give us feedback about the effect that we're actually having on the system. So, for example, we may be using one of the websites and it's slow, so we can see whether or not the requests and responses are actually being sent, how long they're taking, etc. We can dig into the kind of tools and the kind of information that those tools can bring you. Another example is Papertrail. Papertrail is basically a way of gathering lots of event logs together so we can aggregate them into one single view so we can search across them. Very, very cool tool. A good example might be that you're doing something in the interface and the UI looks good. There's no errors, there's no exceptions. But in Papertrail, in the event logs, you can see that you've actually triggered maybe a database error or something. That's really vital stuff that usually would go completely unnoticed. But actually now we can start to dig into that and see the impact that we're actually having on the product. So the combination of tools and data allows testers to see beyond the UI. It allows people to see past what they can see on the screen and actually understand more about what the system's doing. So back to the test case completion. So that's a kind of whirlwind overview of what the process looks like. One of the most common questions I get, and I've had a few questions to try and answer that here now, is how do we actually know when we've done enough testing? So I'll tell you one thing, we don't ever now rely on shady metrics like the test case completion metric. It's just something that we don't rely on. We don't need to use that anymore. Instead, we use a combination of all sorts of stuff. So we have our automated tests, we have our build process, we've got our UI tests, we've got the results from our exploratory testing, which ultimately feed into other processes like questions, defects, more stories, etc. We've also got the data from the product itself. So the data that the product is telling us, are there any exceptions, errors, have we decreased the performance since the last release, etc. And we've also got an in-house pre-production testing phase that the product goes through. So these are all kind of gates and all kind of measures that we can use to say, have we done enough testing? But ultimately, the feedback comes from the customers. So the fact that we can actually work on something and get that into production in a very short time scale means that we get rapid feedback on that. And it means that we can start to really build up a product that the customers actually are wanting rather than waiting 12 months to find out that we've maybe built the wrong thing. So once the story's kind of done, we no longer have this planning for a release point. We no longer have this, here's a big release, let's get everything in it and work towards this deadline. What we have is kind of like a train. It's a release process that just keeps happening. So every single week a release goes out. If your story's in the release, it goes into production. If it's not in the release, it doesn't go in and it waits till next week. So ultimately that's the way that we get the stories out into production, and that's the way that we get the feedback. It's a kind of release cadence that just happens. There's all sorts of clever things we can do to hide things, etc. But ultimately, we're putting stuff into the release and it's going into production each week. So I've actually gone on slightly too long, and I've probably rattled on, and you know, hopefully there'll be some questions popping up in the test huddle, and hopefully on Twitter I'll be able to get to some of those questions after the webinar's finished. But here's just a few closing thoughts about all of that I've just talked about. So the first thing to move from any kind of change is to have a clear vision. Where is it you want to get to? The further that you can shift your testing towards the code, so the further that you can get your testing nearer to the code, the better, because you'll get better feedback. Always be striving to improve the process. There's always something to be improved somewhere. And automate the checking and free the testers. And that is the webinar. Thank you for attending, and please do put those questions on Test Huddle, and I'll hopefully spend a bit of time afterwards answering those for you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Rob. I'm just going to open up my screen here again. And just bear with you for 1 second there now. Okay, so you should all see my screen again. And I just want to bring your attention to our upcoming webinars. And we have a webinar next month on Tuesday the 8th with Jim Holmes, and called 4 Crucial Tips for Automating Your Web Tests. And there's a second webinar on the 22nd, Tuesday the 22nd, with Stuart Reed on Tester Motivation, the results of a 600 tester survey. So now just a reminder that all of our questions about this webinar and discussion will be over on Test Huddle. And let me just share with you the link again. So you should have a link there now that will bring you to this discussion. And I'm just going to open up page here. So this is what the discussion looks like here when you go across. If you have any questions for Rob, you just type them below here, just where I have highlighted, and click submit. So we look forward to hearing your questions, or seeing your questions and see what you have to say. I just want to thank Rob again for today's presentation, and all of you guys for attending. The webinar is now over, and I'll see you in Test Huddle.